we were doing it remotely. How do I advance? Oh, there, thank you. So here's a slide on the new drug application process. And as I said, Biogen submitted their NDA in September, and you'll see that the FDA from this slide has 2 months before they can either accept or reject that NDA. The FDA actually took less time than 2 months, and they accepted it on October 28th. The FDA then has, once they accept it, either 6 to 8 months to make a decision on whether they will approve the drug or not. In our case, with this nusinersen Spinraza NDA, it's actually a 6-month priority review, and that's for 2 reasons. One, that the drug has an orphan disease designation, which can give you a priority review, and that the drug has fast track, which also gives you a priority review. And that would mean that the FDA would have to make a decision on this new drug application, or their goal to make a decision would be April 28, 2017, although it's possible that a decision could come sooner than that. Some activities that occur during this 6-month period, for example, if you look in this lighter green box called wrap-up activities, would be an advisory committee meeting to discuss with the community the drug and how the community feels about that drug. Thus far, we haven't heard any news that we'll have an advisory committee meeting for nusinersen Spinraza, but that is, a formal possibility. The next slide. So one thing to keep in mind about an NDA is that not every drug that submits an NDA, not every sponsor that submits a new drug application, their drug is approved. The chances are quite good. Statistically, over all drugs submitted to the FDA, 90% of them are successful. Another thing to keep in mind is that during this period when an NDA is filed and the FDA is making a decision is the time when it's most typical to have expanded access to the drug. And many of you probably saw that Biogen has opened an expanded access program for nusinersen or Spinraza. But there are several things to keep in mind about expanded access. Expanded access is not the main goal. It will not give and provide the drug to everybody who may get it once the drug's approved. Expanded access still often has limited access, and for some drug modalities, it may not be possible at all to have expanded access. This obviously is not the case with the Biogen drug. And there will be, for most drugs, there'll be issues with criteria. There'll still be entry criteria for receiving expanded access. There'll be capacity. The drug is not in commercial manufacturing yet, so it can, there'll be limits to how much drug that might be able to be provided. And there can be costs. Not costs for the drug, but costs for administering the drug. So during expanded access, more people will have access to the drug than during the clinical trial stage, but much less than approval. And that's why our main goal is to get a drug approval for as many and broad a label as possible. And being able to get a broad label is really about the strength of the data from the clinical trials process. And the better that data is, the stronger it is, the broader label that could be obtained. And of course, that's our goal. We want as many patients with all types and stages and ages of SMA to have access to drug therapy. So, but we totally understand the fact that the closer we get, the fact that we see a drug in sight increases the level of frustration because that approved therapy is just out of reach. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have this webinar to help answer questions and provide information about the process and timeline for an NDA. And our next speakers, Jeanne Ireland and Doug Kerr, are going to help give us more of a framework about what will happen over the next several months during this NDA process for Biogen's drug and also future drugs in that drug pipeline I showed you, which will also continue to go through the clinical trial process. And we will hopefully have as many multiple drug options available for patients to treat as many patients as possible at all types and stages of SMA.
Great. Thank you so much, Jill. Thank you also to the audience. We're already seeing a lot of great questions come in. One I wanted to address quickly, a few of you have already asked if the slides and a recording of this will be available afterwards. The answer is yes. We'll be posting that on our website within the next week or so. But again, please continue to send in your questions throughout the webinar. With that, I am going to turn it over to Doug Kerr. He is the Global Development Team Lead and Vice President for Neurodegeneration at Shire. He's also a member of the Kerr SMA Board of Directors. We're very excited to have him with us today. He's going to talk a little more about the drug discovery process and some of the clinical issues that sort of come into play during the stage of the process. So with that, I'll turn it over to Doug.
Well, it's great to be on this call. Thank you for including me. A couple points. First of all, I have been in SMA for about 18, 19 years, and I've been to virtually all of the Cure SMA meetings. I was the lead of the Biogen nusinersen program for about 9 years. So I do have a bias in that I was involved in bringing that program forward. So anything I say, you should view in the context of that bias. I'm not at Biogen anymore. I'm at Shire, which is another pharmaceutical company. We're not in SMA. What you'll hear from me, which is not very much because I want to hear the questions, is really as a member of the Cure SMA board. That's my perspective. The other issue is, you know, kudos to Cure SMA. What was Families of SMA, but is now Cure SMA, has really gotten us to this point. I mean, as I think over the last 18 years, there were so many periods where a various asset was in development for SMA. It didn't have the money, it didn't have the direction, it didn't have the oversight, and Cure SMA took it, funded it, directed it, and that is ISIS, which became Ionis, which became the Biogen drug. That is Avexis with gene therapy, so many of these things. And Jill showed you the pipeline of whatever, 20 drugs in development. Most of that was led by Cure SMA. So kudos to Cure SMA for really putting us in the position where we have the hard issues of like who's going to get the commercially approved drugs that are coming. It's great that we're having that conversation. They're tough conversations, but they're a lot better than the conversations that we would have is, you know, if there is nothing out there, what are we going to do? So if you look at the next slide, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'm not even sure people can see this, but you'll get the slides later. It really just summarizes that the drug development process is long, hard, expensive. There's a preclinical phase. There are phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials, and ultimately leading us to where we are, which is hopefully to an approved drug. I don't need to tell you the numbers. It essentially costs about $10 billion to get to one approved drug. It takes about 10 years. None of that really matters at this point because we're kind of there. We think we're there. And so what I think really matters is in this phase, what happens? Well, the FDA has the data. They're looking at it. They're looking at the results. None of us has seen all of the data. Many of us have seen most of the data, but none of us has seen all of it. So the FDA will make a call as to whether the benefit-risk ratio supports approval of the drug. That is, that in SMA patients, the benefit exceeds the risk of the therapy. And obviously, the therapy that we're talking about is an intrathecal, meaning a lumbar puncture injection. That's not trivial. And so there must be an unequivocal benefit in order to support that, and the FDA is looking at those data now. Jill mentioned whether or not there would be an advisory committee. Right, that's true. It could happen in early of 2017. None of us knows. The FDA typically does this when they really need input on whether a drug is approvable. And we saw that with Sarepta, with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I don't know whether they're going to need that for this. My hunch is, although this is just my board member perspective, not knowing data, but my hunch is they're not going to need an AdCom. They're not. They're going to approve this, but we'll see. I think one of the critical things for the community is that if an AdCom is needed, it is all hands on deck. Everybody in the community needs to participate, needs to communicate what they want. It is a great opportunity for the community to say, look, this is the disease that we know, we the community know, and this is why we think this is really important. So we'll see if that is necessary or not. Even if it is not needed, there is a lot of discussion that we will yet have with regulators and insurance agencies around the world about who gets the drug. Assuming it does get approved, the question is, for whom? And, you know, Biogen and what we hope will be Avexis coming is basically saying, look, we want this approved for as broad a part of the SMA population as possible. And the regulators and the insurance companies come back and say, okay, well, what's your data? What is your data to support this indication, type 1, type 2, type 3, pre-symptomatic adults? And there is a negotiation back and forth. Nobody knows how that conversation is going to play out. But to the degree to which we can play a role, we the community, we should. We should try to get this drug approved for as broad an indication as we can. So I think that's all in terms of my slides. I don't think there's another slide, right? I think it's more important.
Oh, you're good.
I'm done. So we'll take questions whenever we're done. I think that's the most important part.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. Next, I'm going to turn it over to our next presenter, Jeanne Ireland. She is the principal of Ireland Strategies. And prior to that, she was the senior advisor to the FDA commissioner. And she's going to give us a little bit more information about how the FDA evaluates programs like those for SMA that are currently being considered. So I'll turn it over to Jeanne now.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. My relationship with Kerr's SMA is a bit more recent than Doug's, but I'm very happy to be here. And what I'll go through real quickly today is an overview of some of the tools that FDA has at its disposal when it looks at applications coming in, the benefits of those programs, but also some of the limitations, and then broadly speaking, how the agency looks at the approvability of a product. So I won't go through all the information on the slide, but essentially FDA has a number of special programs in place, and some of them have been around for a couple decades. They're designed to speed the development and/or review of drugs. Each one really offers a different benefit to a sponsor, and a single product can be eligible for more than one of these. Jill mentioned a bit on the priority review, and that kind of designation is a very valuable one in that it shortens the review time, considerably. I think it was good that Jill noted, and I just want to repeat that 6-month review time for priority review products is a goal, not a mandate. FDA does, though, work really hard to meet those goals, and all of its management processes are set up to meet those goals. But it is, again, it's a goal rather than a mandate, and sometimes it's under and sometimes it's over. Fast track, you can see on the slide. Accelerated approval, and we just talk about for a minute because I know this is something that gets talked about in the press quite a bit. So you can see from the slide what kinds of drugs are eligible for accelerated approval. It's drugs for a serious condition and a meaningful advantage over existing therapies, and that the product demonstrates an effect on a surrogate endpoint reasonably likely to predict a clinical benefit. There are typically post-market studies required to confirm that clinical benefit. The reason I hit on this one is the name of this program can sometimes be a source of confusion. Accelerated approval does not mean a faster review, although certainly an accelerated approval product could also be eligible for priority review. Accelerated approval reduces the development time of a product by using a more readily measured intermediate clinical endpoint instead of a direct clinical benefit that would probably require a more lengthy clinical trial to measure. And then I think a number of you are probably familiar with the concept of a breakthrough therapy. This is one of the newer designations from FDA authority. Congress gave it a few years back. And these are really for game changer drugs, drugs that demonstrate some kind of substantial improvement on a clinically significant endpoint over available therapies. And products that receive this designation, in addition to getting really lots of FDA's attention during the development stage, also get senior staff involved, a rolling review, and this designation has the ability to speed both development and review time. Some of the products approved under this program have been approved as little as a few months after submission of the application. Obviously, for orphan drugs, a key benefit of a designation is the 7 years of exclusivity, which allows the developer to keep generic competition off the market for that period of time. But also for orphan drugs, FDA does give really special attention to, and I think that's been a growing focus over the past several years. The vast majority of drugs for rare diseases have qualified in the past for one or more of the expedited programs I just mentioned. So in a 7-year look back that FDA recently conducted, 86% of rare disease products were able to take advantage of at least one of those expedited programs. So on to the next slide. So the key question for the agency, and Doug talked about this already, but is whether the benefits outweigh the risks. And that involves looking at a number of factors. So essentially the evidence, what evidence is there of safety and effectiveness, and how strong is that evidence? They look at the nature and the severity of the condition that the product's designed to help. They look at the benefits and risks of other therapies for the condition. And they look at what risk management tools are available, any efforts that could help mitigate identified risks or to make sure the drug is going to be directed to patients for whom the risk is acceptable, and that can include, for example, warnings on labeling. So FDA's rules do allow flexibility. These decisions are never entirely cut and dried, and they certainly do allow flexibility, in particular for rare diseases. So FDA reviewers, it's a scientific judgment call. What kind and what quantity of data does an applicant need to show to demonstrate safety and effectiveness? And again, just looking at some of the data that FDA has put out to talk about the flexibility they're willing to apply, 81% of rare disease drug approvals, it's allowed something other than 2 adequate and well-controlled trials. So in those cases, they allowed a single adequate and well-controlled investigation along with confirmatory evidence. So labeling, or I guess more accurately, what indications a product may get on it depends on the strength of the evidence, the design of the study, the types of patients included and excluded, the strength of the data the company provides. FDA does do its own statistical analysis of the data that companies send in, and it can come to different conclusions about what indications that data may support. But again, particularly for serious conditions, they do try to show as much flexibility as they can. Just a few minutes, because I think I certainly in working with other patient communities and with industry get questions about what the impact is of some of the recent developments politically and in the FDA world on drug review. And certainly the Sarepta decision was already discussed for a few minutes. As most of you know, it was a controversial decision. My personal view is I would not read it as a shift in policy or process at the agency for broader implications for approval decisions. And potentially there's some impact that that decision might have on the FDA's engagement with patient communities on higher profile issues in the future, but I think it remains to be seen. I also have gotten a number of questions about what the change in administration means for applications pending at the agency now. Typically, there would be no change whatsoever. And this is not a typical transition, and we don't know what the president-elect intends for FDA. But again, while most new administrations want to make their mark on FDA policy matters, thinking about new legislation, new rules, new guidance, typically new administrations have shied away from any kind of interference or influence on individual approval decisions for individual products. So I will end it there, so we have plenty of time for questions.
Great, Jeanne, thank you so much. We're really excited to have you join us. I'm going to turn it back over to Kenneth now. He's going to cover a little bit of what might happen after a drug receives the hoped-for approval from the FDA.
So, as a number of people have said on this call now, we have this full pipeline of programs that are in development. Some of them are early stage still, preclinical, moving forward. There's a number that are in clinical trials, and we certainly hope that many of those are going to advance through to this final stage of getting to the NDA stage and getting approval. But we're really at this point now for the first time ever. So we're right at this point of now proving to the FDA that a drug is safe and it's effective. So that's the stage that we're at right now. One of the things on the timing, I think you've heard here that the official timing is really to go through until April. And this is one of these balance sides that we just wanted to kind of give the information to everybody about, you know, the balance, the best case, worst case of the way things could go. So this could go out to April. Other programs have gone longer than that. But at the same time, I think we've seen the FDA being aggressive. And one thing we've heard from Biogen that Biogen's put out is they think that this may have the chance of going faster. So there is a chance that's been put out that this could be December that we're in now, or the first quarter of next year as well. So that's the flexibility. That's kind of the unknowns that are out there right now, but that's kind of the expectation that we're looking for. It could be from now through to potentially April of next year when we hear the decision. So when we're looking to prove to the FDA, I think one of the things to know is that is all about this drug label. That's what we're trying to prove to the FDA to get this broad drug label. That's the goal. And that influences other things that are going to happen after approval. And in particular, that really does influence the insurance part of what happens after approval and getting these therapies paid for. It's the drug label which really is then going to influence what it is that insurance companies are going to pay for in terms of that indication. So we're looking at approval, hopefully coming up. That's our big goal right now, to get approval, but we're planning ahead. We know that there's things that we're going to have to do as we move from the stage that we're at now with trials and looking for approval to afterwards when we actually have a treatment. So we wanted to let everybody know about these, let everybody know some of the things that we're working on to influence these issues after approval, and also the role that everybody can play as well. So one of the questions that comes up afterwards after you get approval is making sure that you can make enough of the drug. Now that varies when you have either a pill, kind of a small molecule, or you go into kind of some of the newer technologies when you're looking at biologics as well. And some of those can get more difficult to actually make at a scale where you're talking about a treatment rather than a trial. So that's something which everybody's aware of for certain programs. That's something that the companies really kind of focus on, making sure that they can scale things up. Another issue is, as you're moving from trials to treatment, is actually getting the product, once you've made it, delivered, actually getting it to patients. And so this is the area to know about, where we're going from clinical trials where we've maybe had 20 or 30 clinical trial sites doing trials on a few hundred patients, to when we get a treatment, which is what we want. Now we're talking about thousands of patients, and you're really talking about hundreds of sites as well. It's no longer trial sites. It's no longer just the experts that know about SMA. There's new centers that we've got to get ready, up and running, and delivering these therapies as well. So that's a stage that's different from what we've been doing in the past, and it's something we're working on now, getting ready for, and it's really kind of part of the launch when something gets approved. And again, there's some areas to know about there where it varies when you're talking about traditional pills being different from some of the technologies and the therapies that we have in development. Some of these aren't just going to be getting a pill where you go down to the pharmacy and collect it. Some of these therapies are actually the administration, the injection of a therapy as well, and so that makes that delivery part, more complicated. It's something that has to get factored in getting that volume of sites and getting enough places around the country and eventually around the world ready to deliver and do an injection as opposed to just collecting a pill. One of the big issues after approval as well is getting a therapy paid for. And that applies for all drugs, but especially with orphan drugs, rare diseases, it's always the balance of when you have a small group, small population, the price of the therapy is going to be higher. That's the balance that comes into play. And so that's where insurance coverage becomes very important. These therapies are going to be priced high, and so the way to get access to those is for insurance coverage, whether it's private or public insurance, to cover those costs and pay for the therapies. And that's where that all comes back to the drug label. That's why it's so important to get the FDA approval with a drug label that's broad. When you have the broad label, that's what insurance companies look at for whether they will or will not pay for a drug. If it's in the label, if it's covered, if it's a broad label, then insurance is going to cover it, and that's where we get the broad access and people actually get the drug because it's paid for. And then looking out even further as well, we have all these programs in the pipeline. We know that just the first approval isn't going to be the end. We want to build and not just have one therapy, which we're all hoping is going to really give us the answers that we're looking for, but we know we've got to build on that. The real answer to getting what we want, a treatment and a cure for all ages, all types, all stages of SMA, is more than one therapy. So there's a number of ways to look at that. You can look at, once you've got a first approval of a therapy, can you expand that label? If it is a narrow label, can you do additional studies, collect more information that then the FDA would look at and say, more data now, okay, now we can broaden the label. The other angle is different therapies, getting those through the clinical trial process and getting those approved as well. So the next slide here hopefully just outlines in order some of these stages after approval, after number one. And so this lays out, and it's usually kind of in this order, the stages to kind of look at. Number one, getting the FDA approval. After that, one of the key things is the product availability. That's this actually making sure that you can make the drug and get it out to the sites, the centers, the pharmacies that need it. And that is not the biggest issue, but it's something to pay attention to. And the broader the label is, the more patients are going to be getting drug, the more drug you need. And so there's a lot of planning that has to go into making sure that there's enough of the therapy out there as well. The next stage is a treatment decision. And so this is something different than we've had in the past. Again, this is the difference from just looking at where we've been with clinical trials to an actual treatment. And one of the things that we're looking at is we're moving away from just those 20 to 30 clinical trial centers, the experts who know about SMA and SMA care, to other physicians, prescribing doctors who are going to be involved in that treatment decision. And so that's something that we're actually involved in as well, and I think that's something that a lot of people can take a role in making sure that now people outside of the core community of clinical trial experts become aware, become involved, and are going to be involved with training as well in delivering these therapies as treatments. So there's certainly a level of awareness and education and training that needs to happen to reach out to hundreds of physicians, doctors who are going to be involved in this treatment decision and prescribing the therapies. After that, it's going to vary, the process, depending on what the actual therapy is. Some things are going to be pills, oral pills that you take, small molecules. Others are going to be therapies that actually involve an administration, actually a visit into a hospital, and other procedures that go along with it. And so that is also something which needs to be taken into account. It's not just awareness of doctors who are going to prescribe therapies, but actually sites that are going to be ready to administer this therapy as well. And again, that's a process of scaling up from where we've been, 20, 30 sites, to hundreds of sites that we're going to need, and need them to be available as soon as we get approval as well. So that's something which is very important. and something that we've got to make sure once we get a therapy, we can actually get it out. It's no good having a therapy, having enough of the drug, getting it prescribed if you ultimately can't get access to it. So we need to make sure that site centers are ready to deliver these therapies. And then also part of that kind of final process, although it goes all the way from prescription to pre and post procedure, is the insurance coverage. Making sure again that we have the private, the public payers who look at the drug label, looking at what the FDA has done, but looking themselves at the data. That's one of the key things. The payers also look at the clinical trial data to make sure that they are paying for a therapy that has value as well. It's not just the drug label. They actually look at the clinical trial information that comes out as well. So the next slide, just summarizing back that the model that we set up with us, Cure SMA, families, the community, companies as one community together is really set up well, where we do have the same goals, the same incentives. And these are, primarily, we all want a drug that's safe and a drug that works. That's what everybody is kind of ultimately working for. What we're also looking at in terms of kind of the next ladders that we're looking to kind of come through is, obviously, we want approval. That's so important for all these next stages to happen. We want fast approval. That's something which we can have an influence on as well in what we'll get to in a second, some of the interactions that we as a community can have with the FDA. And then finally, we want a broad approval. So approval, fast approval, and broad approval. Those are kind of the goals as we ladder up that we're looking to get as a community as a whole. Again, both companies, families, patients, everybody's got those same goals that we're aiming for. So we can have an impact with the FDA. We've actually probably been doing this for about 2 years now, having initial discussions with the FDA, providing them with information, just general education to start off with about SMA, the community, and now we're getting into more details. So one of our priorities that we're working on with the FDA is making sure that we're going to hopefully get these broad labels. And again, stepping back, this is one of these balanced ones where we don't have the answer yet. We don't know what the drug label is going to be for Spinraza or in the future. We want it to be the broad label. Often with the FDA will look at just the data, the criteria from clinical trials. They'll look at who particularly were the groups, the people that participated in a clinical trial, and sometimes that can limit the label. So that's one of the things that we don't know yet and we've got to watch for. Are the drug labels limited by just the criteria that were set up for clinical trials? Or, as we hope and what we want to have an influence on, is they're broader than that. That rather than just for one certain age or type, we want it for multiple ages, multiple types. And I think in SMA, this is one of kind of the key things for us to go into the FDA and let them know about. SMA is different than some other diseases. We obviously have a big span, a big breadth of symptoms of the way that the disease presents itself, but we have the same genetics. It's the thing that we've always been kind of working on in SMA as a model disease. Everybody that's affected with SMA has the same genetic cause, the main missing gene, and the same backup genes. And if a therapy has the same mechanism working on either that missing gene or the backup gene, it should work for everybody. And so that's one of our key priorities, messages to the FDA that we are going in with and will be over the next couple of months. We also want to make sure that they know what's important to a patient and a family in taking a therapy, what the benefit actually is. We want them to make sure that they're making their decisions about approvals of a therapy for SMA, specifically about what's important to everybody who's on this call right now, to the patients and families with SMA. We want them to make the decisions on whether the benefit of a drug is meaningful in terms of, does it stop the disease? Is that something which families, patients would look at as meaningful? And we think it is. That's information that we've collected. So if a therapy does that, we'd hope the FDA would approve it based on that. Same with also incremental changes. That one of the messages that we said to the FDA is, we hope if a therapy is effective in small improvements, that's enough to get improved as well. It doesn't have to be some huge, amazing result for them to approve a therapy. If a therapy is effective in small changes, just stopping the disease, we hope they're going to take that into account when they make these decisions on approval or not. And then 2 other items that are priorities but kind of stretch out into the future as well is we're trying to make sure that the FDA is getting prepared with how we're going to do clinical trials after we get a first drug approved. And as part of that, but also going forward, how are placebo controls going to be done in SMA in the future? Are they still going to be needed, especially with type 1? Is the FDA still going to be asking for us to do placebo controls after we have a first therapy approved? And that's been an ongoing discussion, and that's something that we'll still kind of work on certainly over the next several years to make sure that the FDA is hearing our priorities on that area as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Kenneth. What we're going to do now is we're going to have a little bit of question and answer time, and then at the very end, I'll come back and I'll talk about some specific next steps for our community that relate to all the issues that we've been talking about right now. I'll lead with a two-part question. I think perhaps Doug, if you want to speak to the first part, and then Jeanne, you want to speak to the second part. We've heard all four of our speakers so far today, Jill, Kenneth, Doug, and Jeanne, talk about the importance of labeling in general and specifically for our community. So this question comes in, number one, for companies. How do they make sure that they're giving themselves the best chance to get a drug approved for the widest demographic possible? And then the second half of the question is, when the FDA makes a decision on a label, is that sort of a one-for-all decision, or if more information, more data comes through, is it possible that the FDA could eventually go back and revisit that decision?
Okay, great question. This is Doug. You know, the company is completely aligned with what the community wants on this. They want the broadest label. And so what we did at Biogen is we tried to study it, the drug, in as broad a population as we could, as quickly as we could, so that the label would be as broad as possible. Type 1, type 2, type 3, pre-symptomatic. Whether the FDA agrees or not, we don't know. But everybody's kind of on the same page, at least from the drug company and the community, to get it as broad as possible. And you know, you'll note that there was a pre-symptomatic study that Biogen conducted to identify patients prior to the onset of symptoms and to begin treatment at that point. All of those data go into the FDA, and we'll see what they say. But yes, there is also an opportunity for a supplemental application to the FDA for a change in the label. That is, that if at some later point we feel like it goes to even, say, type 4 or adult patients, it is possible that you submit those data to the FDA and they will review that, and the label may be changed. And I think that is an effective strategy. And whatever the label is for the SMA drug, our goal as a community is to push for, you know, expanding it as best we can, assuming that we think that there is a benefit risk in a broader population.
This is Jeanne, just to chime in on that second point. Absolutely, and it's common practice for drugs, once FDA has approved a drug, if it's a narrow label or a label more narrow than the company or the community wants, absolutely you can see them re-reviewing and possibly expanding the label if new data or information comes out. Just to be clear, and Doug did put it this way, but I want to emphasize it, it's not FDA gathering the new data and initiating the labeling change, except in very limited circumstances. It's the company that pulls together the new data and submits the supplemental application for the label change. But again, it's very common that drugs are approved for a more narrow use single indication, and the labeling is then expanded multiple times in the future as information becomes available.
Excellent. Thank you both. So another question that we had come through is about expanded access programs. Currently, Biogen does have an expanded access program open for Spinraza, or nusinersen as it was known up until recently. And several are wondering what happens to this sort of expanded access program if the drug is approved. Do people continue to stay on that expanded access program? Do they have to then go out and get a prescription as everyone else does, or how does that work? I think, Doug, perhaps if you want to speak to this first.
Yeah, typically what happens is the expanded access program, which is also called compassionate use, is from, until it is commercially available. In other words, until it's approved and available and reimbursed. So that most patients who are on the expanded access drug, once it's approved, they will roll over to their insurance programs to get it from that point out. Now, exactly what that means, like, do you need to get approval? It depends by the insurance. I will tell you that Biogen is very keen on making this as easy as possible so that patients who are on the managed access drug should have a fairly easy roadmap from that drug until they get onto commercial supply, and there will be no gap. In other words, nobody will allow a child to have a gap in which they cannot get drug for a period of time by virtue of whatever complications. That will absolutely not happen.
Great, thank you. Another question, this one is about insurance. Maybe Jeanne, I'll let you field this one first. What is the relationship, if there is any at all, between the FDA's decision whether to approve a drug and insurance companies making a decision whether to cover the drug? Does the FDA make a specific recommendation to insurance companies, or does that kind of happen through a separate process?
So FDA is not involved in either the coverage decision or pricing. FDA's mandate is to look at safety and effectiveness, and there isn't engagement with the company around pricing or with, generally speaking, with insurers around coverage. Those are separate processes, generally speaking. Although obviously, as Kenneth discussed, insurance companies are looking at data that FDA is looking at, and insurance companies are looking at FDA's decision and factor that into their own decision making about coverage and reimbursement.
Great, thank you. This next question, I'll go ahead and open up to whoever wants to speak up first. The question is about how soon after a drug is approved is it typically available? We've seen, some information even in this webinar about the different steps that have to happen. But is there any information that we have, or any sort of realistic expectation we can have about once a decision is made, how soon the drug might be available?
This is Doug. In the U.S., it actually is at the same time, roughly. Approval and then reimbursement from insurance companies is quite, that interval is quite short. So essentially, once it's approved, you will have access to it. In other countries, it's not quite the same. And in fact, you could get approval in some European countries, and it could be literally 18 months before there's a decision made on insurance reimbursement for the drug. So there are challenges there, but much less so in the U.S.
And maybe the only thing I'll just add on top of that, so they're talking about insurance coverage and kind of getting the payers involved in this process, which they already are. I know they're already involved in some of the discussions that are going on between Biogen and the data that's coming out directly with those insurance providers. I think the one question on access, which we were saying earlier, is it can vary. It can depend on the particular therapy when that drug will actually be available, not from a making it necessarily or an insurance coverage, but the delivery, the availability of it for patients to get around the country, around the world. And so there it's the issue of pills, which are easier to get access to at a pharmacy, versus biologics, where it's an injection, it's a procedure. So that's something which can have an influence on actually getting the therapy, getting access to it, and it being available. And it can lengthen that time out as well.
All right, we will have one more question. I do want to leave a little bit of time at the end so we can talk about some of the specific ways that our community is going to be able to get involved, particularly in just these next couple weeks and months. But we've received several questions about how trials and approvals are handled once a drug is approved. So right now what we're looking at is the first ever approved drug. But we know that if Spinraza is approved, there are still other programs coming along in development. So maybe Doug, if you want to speak to the company side, and then Jeanne perhaps to the FDA side, how do they construct trials to test what's now an approved drug against a new drug? And then when it comes to the FDA, what do they look at? Does it have to be better than the drug that's already approved, or what are some of the factors that they take into account there?
What a great question. I mean, it's a great problem to have, where you're talking about a subsequent approval after you've gotten your first, but it is a challenging one. From the company side, you know, Biogen is going to be out there, and others, including Avexis, are hoping to get there. And it is challenging to make a case to regulators that the second drug has an advantage, or at least serves an unmet need relative to the first one. Maybe it's benefit. Maybe it is convenience, that you only have to do a one-time therapy, or it's an oral drug that does not require lumbar punctures, or maybe it's safety. But somehow, the second drug has to kind of make a case that it is serving a need that is not met by the first one. And so, you know, Avexis is struggling with this. They have data, but they don't have data relative to the Biogen drug. They do not believe that they need that. And the FDA doesn't formally require that you do a head-to-head comparison. And so you kind of try to make the best package available to make a case that you are serving an unmet need and that you have a place for approval, and see what happens.
So just to add a bit to that, as Doug said, it's not as though the agency is likely to be requiring head-to-head studies with the previously approved product, but as we just talked about when we were going through what FDA's thinking is and how it assesses benefits and risks, one of the factors is the benefits and risks of other therapies for that condition. So the second product coming through, and again, that's obviously a good place to be having a second product coming through, does face a little bit of a different scenario in terms of the agency's thinking around that benefit risk assessment.
We still there?
I'm here. Can you hear me, Doug?
I can. It went
Hi
quiet
there.
for a while.
I think somebody's on mute.
Yes, we're still here. We're still here.
Okay.
So thank you all. I wanted to go ahead and talk about a couple of ways that our community can participate in this process, just to sort of close out our time here. So first, to highlight a couple of the current activities that Kerr SMA is participating in that relate to some of the issues that we've discussed in this webinar. So one of the initiatives that we've started just this year is an industry collaboration group. And we've got 7 companies who are working on SMA drug development who are going through different topics, again, regulatory topics, educational topics, clinical trial issues. And what we're doing with them is we're having them work together to share their data, to share their ideas, and to do it in ways that are going to go ahead and benefit our community. Actually, a couple of the initiatives that I'm going to talk about in just a minute are coming as a result of this industry collaboration. Another project that we've just recently announced is our insurance coverage and payment policy project. This is going to be taking a look at the full spectrum of SMA treatment and care. Obviously, it relates specifically to the treatments that we hope will soon be approved and other treatments that we see coming down the line within the next months and years. But we're really looking at everything that we know that our community needs in terms of treatment and care. So the final initiative is the newborn screening initiative, and this relates specifically to having SMA added so that every baby that is born in the U.S. Will be tested for SMA, and then that baby would be able to begin treatment almost immediately, if it turns out they do have SMA. So obviously this is not something that would impact our current community, but we know as things continue to grow, as they continue to progress, this is something we can do to help out those who have yet to join our community. So some specific ways that you as a community member can participate. We've been given a very exciting opportunity. It's called the Patient-Focused Drug Development Meeting. What happens at this meeting is individuals and families from our community come, and they're going to be able to testify directly to the FDA about the issues that are important to us, about some of what their hopes are for a treatment, about some of the day-to-day issues that impact them. And we'll also have opportunities for those who are not able to attend the meeting to contribute. There will be polls, there will be online things where you can submit your comments as well. And what happens in addition to this meeting itself is then we collect all of the testimony, we collect all of our online submissions, we collect all of the polling data, and it creates what's called a Voice of the Patient report. And this goes to the FDA as well, and for any drug for SMA that is going to be looked at, this is part of the review process. This is part of the decision-making process. So it's going to be a great in-person opportunity for us, and it's also going to be a great way for us to sort of create an enduring document that we think is going to impact FDA decisions now and in the future. Another opportunity is a community update survey. We're going to be launching this in the next couple of weeks, and this is going to go out to every single family in our community. There are a number of questions there. It's about a 10 to 15-minute survey, and it just asks some real-world questions. What has been the impact of SMA on your life, or in the case of a caregiver, on your family's life? We're going to be using the data from this, again, to support some of what we're doing with the Patient-Focused Drug Development Meeting, but also to support what we're doing with the insurance and coverage payment project. So to explain to insurers what is the true cost of SMA and what is going to be the true impact of an approved treatment. You all are actually the first to hear. We have a date for our Patient-Focused Drug Development Meeting. It is Tuesday, April 18th, 2017. And we'll be releasing more information in the next couple weeks specifically about how you can participate. And what we're also going to be doing is holding another one of these webinars. We don't have an official date for that yet, but it'll be about probably 6 weeks to 2 months before the patient-focused drug development meeting. And so it will cover specifically what you can do around that meeting, but also more generally, how can our community interact with the FDA. The community update survey, again, will launch in the next couple of weeks, and once that is open, you'll receive an email from Kerr SMA. It will be posted on our website, posted on social media, so you won't be able to miss that. I've listed here a couple ways that you can kind of stay informed on all these different items. Again, you can visit kerrsma.org/news. On the right-hand side, if you're on your desktop, or near the bottom of the page if you're on your smartphone, there's a list of topics. Advocacy, just click on that, and all the stories relating to these different projects that we're working on will be brought to the top. I've shown a little box here, kind of what how to sign up for Kerr SMA looks like on our website. You go scroll to the bottom of any page, you're going to see a box that looks just like that, and just enter your email address, and that will get you onto our list. Or send us an email at info@kerrsma.org and just say, please put me on your email list. As Kenneth mentioned during his presentation, we are also going to be doing a lot of education and outreach to medical professionals, letting them know a lot of the same information, and also really getting them on board in anticipation of new treatments. So if you have a doctor that you see who's not yet connected with Kerr SMA, please encourage them to go ahead and reach out to us. We would actually say send us an email at info@kerrsma.org. Just have them say, I'm a medical professional, I want to learn more, and we'll be able to take it from there. That's all we have planned right now. Again, we thank you so much for your time. If you have any follow-up questions or items you think of later that we didn't get to cover, suggestions for future webinars, info@kerrsma.org, send it that way, and we will get it. You'll also receive, after this webinar, a link to a survey. It's about 3 or 4 questions. Just ask you, did you find this helpful, and kind of what would you like to see covered in the future? So with that, we will end this webinar. Thank you all so much for taking time out of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Megan. This is wonderful.